Hi, and welcome to another installment of Math Basics, Mr. Besh. Today we're going to do a little review and recap. We're going to figure out how to find percents of numbers without using calculators. Now, this can sound like a little bit of an intimidating task, but it's quite basic. It's just going to rely upon some of our prior knowledge, like I like to say in class about using some of the tools in our tool belt. The first thing that you need to remember is where decimal points are in your numbers. Now, obviously, if you can see the decimal point, you know where it's at. But a number like 30, you got to remember that the decimal point, or whole numbers, is after the last term. The other thing you got to remember is each and every time you move a decimal point to the right, you're actually multiplying by 10. So now if you take 30 and you move that decimal point 1 unit to the right, it then becomes 300. We know 30 times 10 makes 300. If you'd move it again you multiply by 10. 300 times 10 would give us 3,000. Now, did you ever think what happened if you moved the decimal point to the left? I'll give you a hint. It's not multiplying. It's its opposite. And that's what we're going to need to do to answer questions along the lines like this. You see, we are going to find percents of numbers. And the way I teach students to do this each and every time is there are 3% that you want to find, and they're basic, that you can find every percent of any number, and quite easily. You always find 10% first, then 5%, then 1%. Two of these you actually find just by moving the decimal place. So let's begin. So if you get your question like, what is 15% of 30? The first thing that you do is you find 10%. To do this, you take your whole value and move your decimal point 1 unit to the left. So now the decimal point gets snug between 3 and 0, and then you get 3. And 10% of 30 is 3. The next one we find is 5%. Now this is done a little bit easier. To find 5%, you just take half of 10. So if 10% was 3, 5% is 1.5. Now notice that I carried this out to the hundred spot in the decimals. I did this because a lot of students learning this for the first time are a little bit better with dollars and cents. And if they can relate this in terms of dollars, it makes it a little bit easier when they add these terms together. Okay? Notice, remember again, that 3 is the same thing as saying 3.00, and 1.5 is the same thing as saying 1.50. Last but not least, we find 1%. Now to find 1%, we don't move the decimal 1 unit to the left. We move it twice. So now the decimal point is in front of the 3 instead of after the 0, and we get 0.30 carried out to the 100 spot. Now you always find these 3 first. And to find any percent of a number, you are going to use any combination of these to add up to make the percent. So now, to find 15%, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 10% and the 5% and we're going to stack them like blocks. 3.00 added to 1.50 is going to give us 4.5 or 4.50. And that's how we make 15%, by adding the 10% and the 5%. Now I'm going to stick with the number 30, and I'm just going to change the percents around just so you can see how this varies. You get a question like, what's 70% of 30? Piece of cake. To make 70%, you actually take 10% 7 times. Now you can add or you can multiply. You could take 3 and add them up by itself 7 times, or you can just do 7 times 3, and that's going to make 21. 21 is 70% of 30. To find something like 12%, well now, to make 12%, you got to take a 10% and add that to 1%, not once, but twice. 10 plus 1 plus 1 is going to give us the 12. So then what we got to do is we got to take the 3 and add that to the 0.3 and then 0.3 again. And that's going to give us 3.6 or 3.60. You get something like 56%. Sometimes you got to use a bunch of these in combination. First off, to make 50%, you use 10% 5 times. That gives us 15. Then you have to use 5% once. That's going to give us 16.5. And last but not least, we have to add a 0.3. We have to add a 1%. Because to make 56%, you got to use 5 50 or 10%, 1 5%, and 1 1%. And then we get 16.8 or 16.80 as our answer. And as you can see, it doesn't matter what percent they ask of us. Just using these 3%, we can calculate the percent of any whole number easily without using a machine. And that's it. I hope you guys found this both helpful and informative.